Thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So as Amina said, I'm a professor at the School of Law. I teach constitutional law, immigration law, and criminal law and procedure. I write a lot about immigration enforcement and the legal issues that are implicated by immigration enforcement. What I was going to do was just give a quick overview of topics that I think are probably reasons why people might be here today, and then I was going to turn it over to Amina to sort of amplify on some of the themes about amplify on particular themes that I'm going to just touch on. So we'll start by just talking about sort of changes in practices that are probably concerning people. So this, this list is a list of some of the many issues that have been raised by the executive orders that the president has signed in recent months. And when I say executive orders, I'm referring to not just the travel ban that was signed a couple of days ago or the old travel ban that was signed in January, but also a couple of other executive orders that deal with immigration enforcement in the interior and at the border that were signed on January 25th. And if you look collectively at those orders, you see a lot of things that are of concern. So one is obviously the ban on refugee admissions and on many foreign nationals from 6 named countries: Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. The old order also included Iraq. Iraq has been removed from the list of banned countries. I'll talk a bit more about the travel ban in a moment, but that's obviously received a lot of press attention. I think the other thing that it's important to recognize is that under the Obama administration, the administration created certain categories of foreign nationals who were more likely to be prioritized for immigration enforcement and for removal. And what the January 25th executive orders do is retract the Obama administration priorities and basically make everybody a priority. If you're present without legal authorization, you effectively become a priority for deportation. Anybody who poses a national security or public safety risk, broadly defined, becomes a priority for deportation. But the old Obama priorities, which prioritize people, in theory at least, with serious criminal offenses, individuals who pose national security risk, or recent entrants, those have been expressly withdrawn, and in its place comes a far longer and more nebulous list of priorities. So pretty much anybody who's present without authorization, and then a lot of people who have authorization but may have criminal records or convictions or immigration histories that are problematic from a legal perspective, may also now be prioritized for removal. So it sort of changes who's the focus of enforcement in some ways. It does not rescind the president's deferred action for childhood arrival memo, so DACA remains in place. There's been a lot of speculation about what the current administration plans to do with DACA, but at least as a formal matter, it remains. Some of you have probably noticed, however, the administration has in recent days arrested several DACA students, taken them into ICE custody, and has raised the possibility of removing these individuals. So even individuals who have deferred action status may be more vulnerable, and certainly the events of recent weeks seem to suggest vulnerabilities for those populations as well. Other things that the executive orders do, there's a threat to remove federal funding for quote-unquote sanctuary cities. The order actually defines sanctuary cities fairly narrowly to include jurisdictions that are acting in violation of a particular federal provision, 8 U.S.C. section 1373, which requires that states not bar certain kinds of communication. So it's actually not really clear that it will have huge impact in terms of its real effect, but what it does have impact on is the discourse. So people who have sanctuary city ordinances are worried that they might lose federal funding, and so I think there's probably more rhetorical force than practical force to this provision. I'm happy to talk more about that if you'd like, but clearly the administration wants to send a signal that they disfavor what they're calling sanctuary cities, and there is the threat of removal of federal funding. There are a lot of constitutional constraints on the kinds of funding cuts that can actually be enacted, and certainly by the president, and so it's not really clear how much force this has. But it obviously has an impact on the mindset of states and localities as they think about how they want to deal with their immigrant populations. The memos also call for an expansion, a significant expansion of immigration detention. It makes clear that people who are in that the default for people who are in removal proceedings will be detention. as opposed to liberty. And so it's pretty clear that the administration plans to expand immigration detention capacity and to put more people who are in removal proceedings in detention during the course of those proceedings. That obviously has an impact on people's ability to fight their case, right? If they don't have access to their families, to lawyers, if they don't have access to work, and can't kind of fund their livelihoods while they're in proceedings, that can have significant impact on people's ability to sort of pursue their cases. And so we might see more people signing stipulated orders of removal in order to get out of proceedings, out of detention, but the effective result of that is, of course, deportation. Obviously, we've seen calls for stricter visa application processing, and we see that also in the travel ban, and along with that, a combined calls for much more stringent vetting of foreign nationals in the visa process, particularly if those individuals are from certain listed countries. Calls for increase in the number of agents for both ICE and Customs and Border Protection, 10,000 more agents for CBP, 5,000 more for ICE. So a total of 15,000 agents. I should say the president can't unilaterally hire 15,000 new agents. There has to be congressional authorization for that process, plus hiring actually has to happen. But the administration has made clear that they want, they're signaling that they want Congress to appropriate in this way and that they would like to expand the size of the enforcement agencies, although they can't act unilaterally. There's also, and some of you probably heard this in the State of the Union address, the creation of an office for individuals who are the victims of crimes committed by people who are present without authorization, and kind of publications of lists of crimes that are committed by people without authorization in quote-unquote sanctuary jurisdictions. This sort of selective compilation of criminal statistics is very obviously political. We can talk more about its motivations, but it's designed to be able to tell a particular story about immigrant populations that this administration wants to tell. And then, of course, calls for swift deportations, including the streamlining of process for individuals in removal proceedings, particularly those who have been present for less than 2 years and might be subject to something called expedited removal. I should make it clear that once immigration proceedings are initiated, the vast majority of people already and under Obama are removed without a formal hearing before an immigration judge. Either they have a previous order that's reinstated, or they agree to removal through signing stipulated orders of removal, or they're subject to other provisions of the immigration law that mean that they're not entitled to go before an immigration judge. So the ACLU estimated that 83% of people in deportation proceedings under Obama were already being removed without seeing an immigration judge. So seeing the immigration judge is really the exception, not the rule. But the new administration has made clear that they think that number's too high, that they want to expand expedited removal and stipulated removals and plan to use administrative removal more aggressively. So that means fewer people probably getting full hearings before an immigration judge. So that's all in the executive orders, but don't scream. You can go on. There are still things that people can do to protect themselves, and I think what we want to talk about today is how people can do that, and we also want to make sure that people are clear on what's happening. With regard to the travel ban, which again is back in the news because it's new and improved, the administration says we now have specific, particular concerns for individuals who are nationals of Iran, Syria, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Yemen. The first travel ban, which also included Iraq, was quite broad and immediate in its effect, applied to lawful permanent residents, applied to all visa holders, and sort of tried to instigate an instant freeze. The new order is more cautious. It excludes lawful permanent residents and people with lawful visas on the date that the order goes into effect, March 16th. Or who had valid visas on the date of the initial freeze, January 27th. But nevertheless, it means that individuals who don't have visas are essentially barred from getting them unless they can get an exceptional waiver. So getting a visa will be more difficult. Renewals are a question mark, I think, in many people's minds. Will we be able to renew effectively if we have one? And that's sort of an unanswered question in a gray area. Lawful permanent residents who do travel and do have the ability to re-enter the country should travel cautiously because there will be increased vetting at the borders for everybody, but particularly for people who are on these lists. There might be concomitant pressures to sign abandonments of lawful permanent residence forms, and people should just be cautious of the fact that that tactic could be used on them, and should be very, very cautious about relinquishing any rights or signing documents in confrontations or in situations where they're dealing with officials in airports, and Amina will talk more about that. And then if you've got an application pending for a renewal or for a visa, I think talking to an attorney at this point is the sensible course of action given the uncertainty. So what about these bans? As we know, they're temporary, or they say they're temporary. It's a 90-day ban. But note the language in the executive order says that the ban will be lifted if the countries listed on the list satisfy the administration with regard to security concerns. So it could be extended, and probably will be extended in the case of some countries. And there's nothing to prohibit the administration from attempting to add other countries to the list by way of executive order as well. We can see that there's a fair amount of executive discretion built into the system, and that this administration is prepared to try to push that. So it could be that other countries are added at a later time. We don't know what will happen with that. And then people are worried about registration and surveillance. Amina will talk more about that, so I'll put that to the side for now. But we just note that we have had domestic registration programs in the past that are geared toward foreign nationals from particular countries, and so there's always the risk that those kinds of programs would be resuscitated. So as I said, who's at risk? Well, always, anybody who's present without authorization has always had a certain amount of risk, but the new priorities, I think, make that situation even riskier. It's harder to sort of see how you fit into a category that's protected. So I think, I won't go through all of this, but I do think it's important to recognize that it's a lot less predictable who will be sort of prioritized for removal in the new administration, and a lot more will turn on the individual discretionary acts of the ICE agent who happens to be present on the ground, or the individual Customs and Border Protection agent making the call, and a lot less of this will be orchestrated at the level of the executive. And the executive orders sort of make that clear, that it's really up to the agents to make determinations about how they want to apply priorities, and that's what's really changed more than anything else, is that it signals very clearly to individual line agents that they have more discretion to act in ways that in the past I think the Obama administration was trying to curtail to a certain extent. And then I just listed here some of the various ways that people can come to the attention of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, obviously through any sort of immigration application or a process that involves an immigration agency like USCIS. Coming into local jails through arrests will trigger database searches. Local police, the executive orders restore the Secure Communities program, which means that everybody who is arrested will have their data run through the DHS databases, and that the administration doesn't have a clear set of priorities in terms of who they will ask local authorities to detain for possible removal. So there's a certain degree of, again, uncertainty about how they'll prioritize there. And then the executive orders make clear that they also want to expand cooperation with states and localities on the basis of contracts. So contracting with state and local police officers to give state and local police officers the ability to enforce immigration law subject to the supervision of immigration enforcement authorities. This is a program that was enacted into law in the 1990s but not used, and then the agreements proliferated under President George W. Bush, so there were over 100 of them, closer to kind of over 150 of them at one point in time, and then tapered down the Obama administration, effectively taking a lot of them off the table and really narrowing the number of 287G agreements. But the new executive order says that this administration plans to use them more aggressively, and so we can expect to see more state and local cooperation. Raids may be more of a possibility and a way that people are identified even if they're not otherwise the subject of the target of the enforcement action, and perhaps public records as well. So there are lots of possible ways that information could get to. So I think what we wanted to talk to today was about sort of in this environment where there is a lot more individual discretion on the part of agents, and where in some localities, states and state and local law enforcement may be involved in these practices, what are your rights? And I think this is where we wanted to focus some attention and possibly, hopefully, do some role play, I think, too. You had that idea. So I just want to run through this quickly, but then we want to work through this more comprehensively. I think the main point that we wanted to make was that you do have in general, everybody in the country has a right not to interact with law enforcement if they don't want to on a voluntary basis. It doesn't seem like that sometimes, but it's true. So when a police officer walks up to you to ask you a casual question, you don't have to give them a casual answer. Your willingness to engage in law enforcement is up to you. And so I think that what happens a lot of times is people feel like they should or they ought to or they're compelled to. But it's really important to recognize that if the conversation is not consensual, then it doesn't have to happen, right? If you don't agree to it or don't want to be participating in the conversation, then it shouldn't happen. So if somebody approaches you, if someone comes to your house, to your door, knocks on your door, and wants to come in, don't open the door. Once you open the door, you're consenting, right? That's the opening of the door is the sign that you agree that people can come in, and so you don't want to do that unless you do agree, right? If you do, fine. But I think what you generally want to do if you're concerned, as all citizens should be concerned about whether law enforcement can be in their home, and this goes for all residents and citizens, right, is to ask for a warrant, right? Do you have some sort of judicially authorized document that says that you can come in? And if you do, please push it under the door so that I can look at it before I open the door. So you should ask for a warrant before you consent to entry. You should not consent to entry at all. And then you should only allow entry if there is a warrant that is signed by a judge, a judicial warrant. That piece of paper does allow them to come in. It also means if you don't let them in, they have the capacity perhaps to enter regardless. So once you have that warrant in hand and you see it, then you should you can cooperate, but I don't think there's any reason to affirmatively let law enforcement in if they don't have the right to be there. Similarly, you don't have to have conversations or answer questions for law enforcement. You don't have to say anything about where you were born or when you were born or what you do, what your place of business is, etc. So you have the right to remain silent, and you shouldn't give information consensually, right? You should just stand on your rights and not share information consensually. So again, if you're arrested and questioned, then there are a whole set of rights that come with that. But short of that, you don't need to be engaged in consensual conversations. If you are arrested, I think it's an important thing to remember that you should ask for an attorney, and you should ask for the right to speak to an attorney. And whether or not one is going to be appointed for you, you do not have to speak without the attorney, and so you should ask for that attorney. And the final point on the slide here is that everybody in the home, when you're dealing with people coming to your home, should know the plan, and this includes small children or elderly people. Everybody who might open the door should be made aware of the fact that for a variety of reasons you're concerned about the possibility of law enforcement coming to the home, and that you want to ensure that the integrity of your home is preserved, and that there is no obligation to open the door. So don't. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but that's just a teeing up. If you are outside the home walking down the street and you are approached by a police officer, an ICE agent, you are free to leave. In theory at least, right? We can talk about the practical in a bit. But you are free by law to leave. And so if you're being stopped and you feel like you can't leave, you should ask, am I free to leave? And the officer needs to answer that question, because one of two things has to be true. Either you are in fact free to leave, and you should leave, or you're not free to leave, in which case they are now asserting official control over you, and they have to have some sort of a justification for that they can defend and articulate in court. So that's why it's so important to ask. Be very explicit about it. If you're not sure, right? If you're not sure if they're holding you against your will or not, ask. Am I free to leave? Do it politely, do it nicely, don't pick a fight. But ask if you're free to leave, because it's important for you to know. Because if you are, you should go. And if you're not, you should know that, because that's a moment at which the officer needs to be able to articulate a reason as to why, and they are going to need to be able to articulate a convincing reason for a court. Carry valid, if you have immigration status, you should carry the valid documents that that establish that fact, right? You should have those with you and be able to show them. You don't need to show them just for the sake of showing them, but bad things happening. So you never want to be given in the position of either carrying and having false documents confiscated or showing false documents. But documents that are valid, documents that, and even if you don't have valid immigration status, documents that establish your long-term presence here that are valid and that don't necessarily give away your kind of personal information that you wouldn't want to give away. So it may be, report cards or something that show your long-term presence in school that might be able to establish that you've been here for a long enough time that you're entitled to more procedural process in an immigration hearing, for example. Those kinds of documents can be useful to carry, but don't carry things that are going to get you into trouble. Certainly don't run or resist, and this slide reminds us that if you have children, that's obviously always good to communicate. You don't want to be in a situation where children are left unattended. And then you, for your own information, also want to document the encounter. So if you are stopped and you do have an encounter, to the extent possible, you should try to get the information about who is stopping you and making sure that you record the nature of the encounter to the best of your ability in case that becomes relevant at a later time. Again, we'll talk more about this in a bit. If you are out of status, or if you're concerned about your immigration status, or if you have family members who may be concerned about immigration status, it would be good to get screened at this point in time to see if there may be any possible forms of relief or any issues that maybe you don't see. The University of California Undocumented Legal Services Center can help if you are out of status or if you have family members who are. Their contact information is available on the web, and as a UC student, you have access to their assistance. So screening could be something that it's important to do. Important documents, collect them and keep them in a safe place. We'll talk a bit more about that in a moment too, but just making sure that you are ready and that you know where the important financial and personal documents are. And for individuals with kids, in particular, but also with unique medical needs, it's good to get those things squared away so that you know who you're going to contact if you are detained and who can be helpful to you. Doing some detailed family planning might also be useful, and I'm happy to answer questions about that too. And if you know someone who's been detained and you can't find them, ICE does have a detainee locator. You need to know the A number, quote unquote, the alien number of the person who is being detained, but if you have that information, you should be able to locate them. So it's important for you to have that information for people whom you might want to be able to track so that you can find them in the system, maybe help them find an attorney or connect with an attorney or get them other forms of assistance, at least know where they are and possibly visit them. And that might be difficult to do if you can't find them in the system. There's nothing that requires ICE to detain someone locally. ICE can and does detain people all over the country and transfers people with some frequency, and so it's really important to be able to track people who might be in the system. And I think we'll deal with all that later, so I'll flag self-care. Take care of yourselves, right? Be good to you. And we'll talk more about some of the other issues in a moment, but I want to give Amina time.
We've been around for about 80 years this year. We were organized with the rise of the labor movement back in the late 1930s. We were the first racially integrated bar association, and we've been partnering and at the forefront with movement groups in every major movement since then. So a little bit of my own background. I worked for several years as the staff attorney for the local office of the Council on American Islamic Relations, CARE. Through that work, I focused on casework involving civil rights and discrimination involving the Muslim American community. For those of you who are not too familiar with just like some real basic stuff, the American Muslim community, we're very diverse. We're composed of every ethnicity and cultural background. Islam is a religion, it's not a culture. And so we have both citizens, non-citizens, immigrants, non-immigrants, indigenous folk, and others. So it's very, very diverse. Oftentimes we're lumped into the category of immigration because we have so many immigrants. But really when I talk about a lot of this applies to basically what I've seen is against the broad group of Muslims. We're targeted as a group. At CARE, I did a lot of employment discrimination. I did some school discrimination, but I also did a lot of work involving national security and policing issues. So in my tenure there, I handled or advised in our office at about 200 cases involving FBI visits to people. We also did a huge amount of problems that people were facing upon entry into the United States. We call them ports of entry, or people faced at the airports with screening or other watch list issues. And I'm going to get into all of this. So for those of you who are not American Muslim, how does this apply? Well, for one thing, these practices that we've seen over the last several years are not new. They're not exclusive to the American Muslim community. You can go back decades and see how these tactics, FBI, infiltration, questioning of our communities, the misuse of the judicial process has been used to take down movement groups since the civil rights era and before. So it's not just about us. Secondly, as I'll get into it a little bit more, when we encounter the state, the enforcement state, whether it's FBI, local law enforcement, DHS, which is ICE and other groups, it's not necessarily, the face of that encounter is not necessarily what's going on, right? So I might encounter an FBI agent, but there might be immigration consequences behind it. Or I might face an ICE agent, but there might be criminal implications behind that encounter. So that's why it's important to understand all these different arenas. The third reason why all this is relevant and important is because we need to think proactively about what this administration is going to do and how they're going to target our collective communities and our individual communities. So for example, Professor Chacon mentioned about how the Trump administration now is going to try to publish weekly data about crimes committed by immigrants, right? That sounds horrendous, and it really is. But as you can see, they're trying to create, they're criminalizing the community and trying to create a whole nother department within the Department of Justice to specifically focus on immigrants. So they're criminalizing a community. Now you can start seeing how like the funding is going to be poured into this department. They're going to try and justify that funding by finding more crimes, more things to target the community with, just as happened with the Muslim community with the counterterrorism work. So we can kind of see the patterns to see how to think proactively about what the administration is going to do and how it's going to think systematize some of these systems of oppression. Does that make sense? Okay, so I'm going to go over FBI interactions and travel stops. So the first I'm going to go into FBI encounters. So again, just some basic information. What we're talking about, the branches we're talking about are under the executive branch. So there's the President of the United States, the executive branch. Under the President, there are departments, right? You all have heard of his cabinet. I'm sorry if this is like poli-sci 101 for some of you, maybe those of you in the science field, this is like totally new. So there's his cabinet of all the different heads of these departments. So there's the Department of Justice, and the head of the Department of Justice is the Attorney General. Also within the Department of Justice is the FBI. The FBI has its own director. For many, many years, it was Director Mueller. Throughout most of my work in this area was Director Mueller. A famous prior FBI director was J. Edgar Hoover, right? He'd established the COINTEL program. The FBI director does not necessarily take orders from the Attorney General. Then there's also the Department of Homeland Security. So there's a secretary of the Department of Homeland Security. And within the Department of Homeland Security, you have, so there's DOJ, Department of Homeland Security. Within DHS, you have ICE, which is a lot of what Professor Chacon was talking about, Immigration and Customs Enforcement. You have USCIS, which is United States Citizenship and Immigration Services, which is more what they call like the customer service arm of immigration. So you have enforcement, and then you have USCIS. You all might be too young for this, but before 2003, I think was the reorganization established of DHS. It was all Immigration Enforcement and Services was all under INS. You all heard of INS? So they separated out as two different departments. There's also TSA, Transportation and Security Administration. They handle the screening in the airports when you're trying to get on a plane. And then there's also Customs and Border Protection, CBP. CBP are the folks when you're trying to enter the country and trying to get in. They're the ones searching your stuff, asking you questions, whether you're at the airport or at a land port of entry trying to drive in. Does all that make sense? I should have a slide about that. I know. I used to have this really handy dandy slide where I would click, 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 and then all these things would come up with really cool pointers, and I lost that presentation. So I will get that again. So when you are interfacing, like in the street or at your home, I use the scenario of knocking at your door, because that's what we see a lot. So if someone's knocking at your door, excuse me, we have some questions for you. Who is it going to be? Yes, it could be FBI agents. Let me tell you about FBI agents. There's always two of them. They're always like plain clothes, oftentimes with a blazer. One of them has sunglasses on. The other does not. They never have business cards. Oh, you know, I'm just getting them reprinted. So often they don't have business cards on you. The one with the sunglasses is usually the silent one. And the one without the sunglasses is usually the one talking to you. If they're not FBI agents, they could be any of these agencies, because all these agencies work together in this context on Joint Terrorism Task Force. There are multiple task forces that the government has, like you can think of like drug enforcement task forces, narcotics task forces. Specifically, the JTTFs are counterterrorism task forces. So sometimes they may be wearing JTTF jackets. They're like navy blues with like orange letters that say JTTF. But they could also be local police department and identify as police department. They could be sheriff's department and say we're with the OC sheriff. They could be CHP, they could be ICE, they could be US Marshals, they could be investigators with the district attorney's offices. All these fire departments and so many more work with the JTTF and share information amongst each other. So oftentimes what the FBI will do is they know that we know not to talk to the FBI. So they'll send someone else on the JTTF will go. And sometimes it might be someone from the sheriff's department in uniform, and it might be that FBI agent in plain clothes with the sunglasses, right? And what we see in the other context of ICE and immigration encounters is that ICE often poses as police officers to get people to open their doors. So they'll just say, police, we have some questions. So again, going back to my initial statement is, when you encounter the enforcement state, you don't know who you're encountering and why they're encountering you. You may think you're encountering a police officer, and you're like, I'm not involved in terrorism, like I can talk. But what if you have a friend in your apartment who they have an ICE arrest warrant, administrative warrant for, and you don't know they're undocumented? So you don't know the reason behind your interaction or why they're knocking at your door. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So why are they at your door? In this context, there are a few different reasons. One, it could be what we call a fishing expedition. They're just looking for information. To let you know a little bit more about counterterrorism work, what I've heard is that no FBI agents like to do counterterrorism work because it's like chasing ghosts. There's no solid leads, there's no solid information. They don't know even what constitutes a terrorist act and what they're looking for. In 2008, the Attorney General passed guidelines expanding the threshold under which an FBI agent can conduct a threat assessment. So you don't even need reasonable suspicion, probable cause. These are all like legal terms. You just have to have a kind of a hunch, and you can go and visit someone. After the Attorney General passed these new guidelines in 2008, in the first 3 months, there were over 11,000 new threat assessments across the country in just 3 months. So literally, going to someone's door, knocking on them and asking them questions, gathering information, going back to their desks, typing up notes, and then those notes go into basically a lot of information sharing platforms that the government has. They also might be at your door because of a report of suspicious activity. What is suspicious activity? Do you all see those notes around town? If you see something, say something. They're essentially encouraging you to report what they think is suspicious activity. But there's no clear guidance. There's no, suspicious activity is First Amendment protected activity from a civil rights attorney standpoint. So what are some things that I encountered as suspicious activity? One time I had a case where a man who's originally from Saudi Arabia he lived across from a school, and he was doing work in his garage, and the garage door was open. And he had a Saudi Arabian flag hanging inside his garage. And the Saudi Arabian flag has some Arabic on it. So somebody called the FBI, passing by his garage, and now he has FBI agents knocking on his door asking about that flag. Another report of suspicious activity is a woman who is Indian she was visiting America, and she was sending to herself in India through, I think it was like Kinko shipping or FedEx or something, a BB gun. She lives near the jungle, and she needs a BB gun to literally ward off jungle animals. So the person at this office, this mailing service, contacted FBI because she wears a hijab, a headscarf. She was dark-skinned and sending herself a BB gun. So we had FBI agents knocking on her door, inquiring about this sale. Other reports of suspicious activity, I had a client who was autistic, a young man under 18. So actually his parents were my clients. And he was on an airplane by himself, and he was demonstrating erratic behavior. He was low-functioning autistic. So they visit him at his home. The flight attendants reported it to FBI, and now they're contacting him. These are sorts of reports of suspicious activity, where, of course, the underlying reason people are calling it in is because of discriminatory bias, right? Implicit or explicit. Sometimes, however, the agents are at your door because they're seeking information about someone else, right? Where you are not the target. They want information about some other activity. And lastly, and it's not on this slide, but I will get into it later, is they are trying to find informants. They are probing people and wanting to find people who could serve as informants. Okay, next slide. So, this slide is called I've Got Nothing to Hide, I Got Tea Brewing. American Muslims, a lot of us come from Middle Eastern, Arab, South Asian countries. Tea is very big. So we have this joke of people telling FBI agents, especially even after a Know Your Rights presentation, oh, please, please, please come in, have a cup of chai, have a cup of tea. So what's so dangerous about an interaction with law enforcement? Some of you might be thinking that. Some people think I can make this go away very fast. I know my rights, I'll make this go away. Some people think it'll make me look more suspicious if I don't talk, right? And let me say as well, as I go through these are all statements that the agents might make to you to try and convince you to talk. I've heard every single one of these come from agents' mouths. I want to do my civic duty. You need to do your civic duty. You want to become a citizen, you want to be part of this country, prove it. You may want to know what this is all about. I just want some information. I'm not going to say anything, but I want to get information from them. Let me just pause there and say, who is the expert in interrogation techniques, you or the feds? Just saying. I'll be careful. I know my rights. I'll be really careful. If I don't cooperate, they'll go to my neighbors, they're going to go to my work, or they're going to put me on a watch list. And each one of these, I've actually heard FBI agents say to me or to my clients, that we'll go, if you don't give us some information, it's fine, but we'll go talk to your neighbors. We'll go show up at your work. You're going to end up on a watch list because we can't substantiate that you're not a threat. So what is all this? This is all wrong. Okay? These things are not true. You will not be able to make this go away fast. And how do I know this? Because people have cooperated and this has not gone away. People have cooperated and they still go to neighbors, the employment, and put people on watch lists. I sat in my office with an LAPD officer and an FBI agent and my client. The client answered the questions. They did not. You guys remember that case of Captain Underpants? Right? The guy who something hidden in his underwear on the plane? So it was related to that case. And basically, he answered their questions. They still put him on a watch list. Now, every time he travels, he's held for like 7 hours. He's a US citizen. So the moral of the story is, you have rights, so use them, right? The worst thing that you can do is to try and handle this on your own and to talk to agents. One, because you don't know what they're after, as we said. You don't know if it's something about you. You don't know if it's a suspicious activity report. You don't know if it's a fishing expedition. You don't know if they're trying to get you to become an informant. Or you don't know if you're going to offer that one piece of information to put someone away, right? Unjustly. False statements to federal agents additionally can lead to felony charges under 18 U.S.C. 1001. So for example, they ask you a question. Do you know such and such person? And you say, I don't know them. But you did actually meet them. You haven't interacted with them. You have just provided a false statement, and there are qualifications like knowingly misleading and such. But now you can potentially face charges. Federal felony charge. Felony charges mean you serve jail time. That's what a felony means, that you can actually serve jail time for this. So now they've caught you on providing a false statement or an inconsistent statement. So I have seen this happen too, where now they come back a second time. And now when they didn't have fodder to coerce you into becoming an informant, now they have something against you. Now they say, well, last time you said this, and we have such and such post on Facebook that says the opposite. So if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to charge you on this and you're going to spend time in jail. So just that one little interaction can change the entire landscape for you and change what you may be vulnerable for. Like I said, you can unknowingly provide them with the exact piece of information they're looking for. So I had a case once where they were trying to prove material support charges against someone. And they wanted to prove that these people were roommates. So a simple question is, did you used to live at this address? Right? Well, now that simple information of where they used to live is now providing information that they were a roommate, a such and such person, and if they drove that person around, offer them clothing and things like that, they can face now material support charges, providing material support to a terrorist organization. You can make yourself more vulnerable to be pressured into becoming an informant. And as Professor Chacon said, by consenting to their entry, they don't need a search warrant to search what they see in plain sight. So for example, I've got nothing to hide. They can just come in, right? My living room is spotless. But let's say you're that man with that Saudi Arabian flag, right? And they're trying to prove some sort of thing involving Saudi Arabia. Well, they come into their living room and they can look around, and if they see that, they can search that, but now if that leads to probable cause, they now have the basis to conduct an entire search. Again, I'm skipping over a lot of legal qualifications here, but they can now more easily get a search warrant or conduct a search of the house if it falls within the other exceptions. So you all see how risky this is? Like, am I not emphasizing the risk? Y'all get the risk here? Okay. So you all are convinced now. Who is not convinced not to speak to the feds? If so, speak now. All right. Because when we do role play, then everyone should get this spot on. So what should you do? As Professor Chacon said, don't open the door. You can speak through the door. You don't have to speak at all. You don't even have to answer the door. If they have a search warrant, you can say, do you have a warrant? Even if they have a search warrant, if it's not an ICE administrative warrant, but if it's a search warrant or a arrest warrant signed by a judicial officer, they are coming in, whether you are consent or not, right? So you do not have to open the door. However, if you resist their coming in, like if you barricade the door or put your body against it, they can try to prove that you were obstructing justice. That's the only thing. So kind of, if they have a search warrant, hands up, don't shoot, don't speak type of thing. And these are difficult situations. I have had cases where they knock and announce, and then they what's it called when you ram? They ram the door open, right? And I had a situation once, and I'll get into raids later, but where a woman was home alone with her 2 little children. It's very, very difficult. Get their business card and contact information. This is magic. When they know, whether it's at the airport or in the streets, on the sidewalks, at your home, at your workplace, when they know that they can be held accountable for what they are doing to you, the whole interaction changes. So if you don't remember anything else, just remember, stay silent, don't consent, and ask if you're free to leave, and ask for business cards, contact information, or badge numbers, whatever it is, depending on the enforcement agency. So when they're knocking on your door, what can you tell them? You can just stay silent and not do anything. You can say, go away, get off my property, and don't come back. And I've always wanted to see them not go away and somebody call the cops that somebody's trespassing on their property. I would love to see that. So someone do that and let me know how it goes. You can say, I'm not speaking to you. You just say, I'm not speaking to you. You can say, leave your card and I'll have an attorney contact you. And while you're saying this stuff, they're going to use all those other things I had on the other slide. Well, if you don't have anything to hide, why don't you speak to us? This makes you look more suspicious. Fine, you don't want to speak to us, we'll just go next door to your neighbor. They will try all those things, but just hold your line. Or use a couple of these if you feel like you need to switch it up a little bit. And always remember, I do not consent. They're opening the door, they're coming in. I don't consent to this. Okay, next slide. So what an attorney will do. And when you're looking for an attorney, these are the things you should find out if they will do to make sure that the attorney you're working with knows how to handle these situations. Unfortunately, we have had examples of immigration attorneys who don't know about FBI encounters and such. So they will set up meetings with FBI agents without even really conferring with the client. So a good attorney will contact an agent and they will say, my name is so-and-so, I'm representing so-and-so, and I'm hereby requesting that you cease contact and communication with my client. If you have anything further, you can contact me. That's what your attorney should say in these situations. They will ask the FBI agent what this is all about. I'd like to know what the underlying matter is. They will ask if you are the target or the subject of an investigation, or if they are just looking at you as a witness. They will often request written questions. Why don't you provide us with your questions for my client in writing? And they will also ideally send a letter to the agent saying all this stuff, like I represent so-and-so, and then they'll have you verify it by signing that that attorney is representing you. How does this usually work out? So we can go to the next slide. So what will happen? In most situations, your attorney will leave a message at the general FBI mailbox and never hear back. That will be the end of it in terms of the encounters with those agents. If the agents do get back and they do discuss matters with the attorney, your attorney will discuss with you whether and how to respond. From my experience, when it was that narrow area of a suspicious activity report, I was able to clear it up. So that woman who was sending the BB gun, yes, it was wrong that they were targeting her, but I sent them the receipt and they were happy. For the young man who was autistic, I explained the situation and they closed the file. Because a lot of these agents just have a ton of files and they just want to close them and be done. It's not always the case, but a good attorney can help you get to the bottom of what is involved so you don't have to do that dirty work and also implicate yourself in the process. If you and your attorney get to the point where you're considering having a sit down or providing written statements or responses, make sure you consult with a criminal defense attorney at that point. You really want somebody who understands the totality of criminal exposure in any given circumstance. So from material support issues to tax fraud to aiding and abetting. Nowadays we're facing situations of harboring fugitives due to the sanctuary spaces movement. So you want to consult with a criminal defense attorney, not someone who just does DUIs. A lot of the attorneys who do DUIs do it to help pay the bills, but they have like this wealth of other knowledge. So don't also just dismiss attorneys, but you want to make sure somebody understands the whole range of criminal exposure, what crimes are out there that you might be implicated for. And then I don't see this enough, this last point, and we need to see this more. So we both have given you a lot of context of what is happening. What happens most time is when people encounter the enforcement state, they shell up, they stay quiet because they don't want themselves to seem more guilty. But like I said, oftentimes the FBI and others are already going to your employer and to your neighbors. You need to be able to open up and talk about these things. So if it was me, and if I just had an FBI agent come, I would go to my employer or my HR and I would say, look, this has just happened. I want you to know that this has been going on for a long time in our communities, impacted communities, communities of color, however you want to describe it. And if they do approach you, I want you to know, I want you to feel free to come to talk to me about it. And I would ideally prefer if you do not speak to them and you help to uphold my First Amendment rights. If you don't feel comfortable talking to an employer about that, you may want to think about where you're working and why you're working there. You know what I mean? Does that make sense? Like, you should be able to have your employer help protect your First Amendment rights and to help fight against the discriminatory and biased state. I know that's tough in Orange County, right? Sometimes easier said than done. But by doing this training, we're not just hoping that you protect your own rights, but that you all become forces out there, right? Forces of information, speaking truth to power on all of these things. That's why we do these trainings, right? Otherwise, we can just sit in our offices and wait for people to call us when something comes up. So that's that for FBI encounters. I think that's the last slide. Oh, the raids, right. Okay, I'll go through this really quickly. You have the right to remain silent. Just say, I don't consent. You have the right to be treated respectfully and to religious accommodations. You have the right to request to deal with somebody or have somebody pat you down, search you of your own gender, identity, or presentation. And this can be really difficult because oftentimes raids happen at 7 a.m. in the morning before people have dressed in the way that they usually present themselves to the public. So this can be really difficult, and I would just recommend first encounter being, I identify as such and such, or I am a woman who wears a headscarf, I am a Sikh man who wears a turban, whatever it may be, get that across and make yourself heard because you have the right to be respected. Request to see a copy of a search warrant and receive a list of items seized. You are supposed to be given a receipt. Make a note of who is conducting the calling the shots. There's always somebody there who's kind of standing around not doing anything who is calling the shots. And you want to try and get the business card of that person. This is not easy, again, because often it's early in the morning. They come with their AK-47 or whatever assault rifles pointing at people. They come, throw people to the ground, handcuff people, take them out into the front lawn if you're in a single family home, like put you across your garage, handcuffs, all your neighbors can see you. It's not an easy situation. So just remember to keep your cool, get the information, don't obstruct, and stay silent. And then after it's all done, you can also, before we get to after it's done, if you have access to a phone and can contact a nonprofit organization, advocacy organization, someone you know, a friend, family member who can do that so we can try and get there on site, right? But if you don't have access to your phone, it happens. So after it's done, you have ideally the property list of the items that are seized. Review the home to look for damaged property, because they do damage property and you can do a claim for damages. You want to review the property list, see what has been taken that maybe is not on the list, and then also take notes of what you remembered, because that's really helpful. So take pictures and video also if you can, either during the raid or after the raid. And I will go over at the end who to contact after all this has happened. Okay, next slide. So travel and airports. I think we're doing okay on time. I'll kind of go a little bit faster. Is it 12:40? My watch froze at 12:40. What time is it? 1:12. Okay, so I'll try to wrap up in about 15 minutes, 10 minutes. And then we can do some role play and Q&A. So travel and the airports. So again, who is at the airport? Jurisdictional issues are so fascinating because we can also use them because these agencies are really like sticklers about their jurisdictions. So outside of the airport, before you actually get into a terminal, even oftentimes in the, what's it called, where you drive, the airport drives, it's often local police. Once you get inside a terminal, the jurisdiction there, enforcement jurisdiction, is TSA, Transportation Security Administration. Once you, okay, so imagine you're the checking in agent, right? Police board, right? So like I can show you my boarding pass, you take it, and now like I start walking into the jetway to get to the plane. Once you come into the jetway, this is now CBP, Customs and Border Protection. That's where their jurisdiction starts. So their jurisdiction is also when you're coming into the country and getting off a plane and before you actually enter into the terminal, into the airport, that's CBP jurisdiction. CBPs wear like dark blues, they're almost black. TSA agents wear the white shirts with the blue pants. Local police departments wear whatever uniforms they have. And then FBI. FBI doesn't have jurisdiction, but they're all often involved in these encounters. Okay, next slide. Okay, why are you being stopped? This slide refers to being stopped by TSA or by CBP. Can I now just start referring to the acronyms? Did you all follow along as who is where? TSA, CBP? Okay, if you need clarification, just raise your hand and I'll spell it out again. Okay, so the stop and questioning can be random and discriminatory. It's never random and not discriminatory. I had a case once, I was young, this is like 10, 11 years ago. I had a vacation in the Bahamas. I know, right? I was vacationing in the Bahamas with my husband. This was like 2007 or something. And I was going through pre-check, CBP pre-clearance in the Bahamas, like in Nassau. And I was like, I'm gonna dress like so not scary because I'm a Muslim woman with a hijab. So my scarf had like all these like Hawaiian floral prints on it. And I was like, I'm so not scary. So I'm like going through TSA and my husband's with me and he's like taller, he's got a small beard, but I'm obviously Muslim, he's obviously Muslim. And so we're waiting in line and then this TSA agent comes. Excuse me, sir, do you mind coming with me? And we're just like, what? She's like, sir, it's just random, you know, it's just random, it's totally random. And I'm like, no, that's not random. You're pulling him out because he's Muslim. She's like, no. And my husband like goes with her in question. And just to show the great intersectionality and history of these issues, there was this fantastic young black man standing in front, and he was just like, let the profiling begin. And I was like, thank you. And I loved that moment because yes, it was not random. Yes, it was discriminatory, but it empowered me to remember, oh my gosh, it's not just Muslims, right? Like there are other groups who are and will always face discrimination in this country. Watch list issues. This is like the chunk of why people face what they face. In addition to what we're seeing with the executive orders, this is a huge chunk. So there are government databases, without getting into too much detail, but the main kind of winnowed down database is called the Terrorist Screening Center Watch List. It is because of this list that we get a lot of problems. So within that list, there are different categories of people. You have the biggest category, the people who, quote unquote, pose the biggest threat, is the no-fly list. Guess what people who are on the no-fly list cannot do? Yes, thank you. People on the no-fly list cannot fly. They cannot get a boarding pass. That's how you know if you're on the no-fly list. Otherwise, you really don't know if whether or not you're on this list because they always say we cannot confirm or deny. We cannot confirm or deny. And then there are the category below that is called the selectee list. So selectees always get additional screening and always get additional questioning. So I put up name match here and actual designee because within this, there are so many more names than there are people. But if you have a name that is similar to someone, you will still get pulled aside, even if you're not the actual person they're trying to put on the list, but because you have the same name. That's why they always say when you're booking a flight, always put your date of birth and your middle name. Because you want to put as much information to help signify that you are not the person that they're after. It's very easy to get on a watch list and extremely difficult to get off. The third reason that you might be stopped is, again, because of a report of suspicious activity or because of what an officer, TSA, CBP, whoever, might think is suspicious activity. Okay, next slide. So going through security, so this is through traditional security screening, trying to get onto a plane by TSA. You have the right to request a pat down by someone of the same gender in a private room. If you want to go through that big thing, you can go through that big thing. It's called Advanced Imaging Technology, AITs. You have the right also to pat down your own headwear and neck area. So as a Muslim woman or often Sikh men who have the turbans, we like to pat down, or especially for Sikh men, it's very, very important. It's extremely offensive for someone else to touch the turban. So you do a self-pat and then they do a chemical swab of your hands. You have the right to religious clothing as you go through the screening process. And if you don't feel comfortable with it, you ask to speak to a supervisor and file a complaint. And then you also want to help us determine why you are going through this extra screening. Always keep your boarding pass and check if it has SSSS, which is Secondary Security Screening Selectee, and signifies whether or not you are on a watch list. Okay, next slide. At the gate, again, so before I turn in my boarding pass, if you are approached to answer additional questions, or as they often do, they ask you how much money you have and then ask you to count it out. Ask immediately for a business card and to speak to a supervisor. Ask if you are free to travel without asking those questions. Say things like, I know my rights, I already went through security, I'm not going to answer your questions, am I free to travel? And that's the best approach, because what they try to do with getting people to count their money is to catch people in lies, because you have to declare if you're traveling with over $10,000. Okay, next slide. On the airplane, if you are asked, this is before departing, during flight, or during landing, if you are asked to answer further questions or asked to leave the plane, ask for the reason. Because it helps us to determine, again, is it because you're on a watch list? Was it because of a random discriminatory act? They saw something suspicious. Secondly, and very importantly, ask if the pilot is requesting this. The pilot, under federal law, has a lot of discretion to determine who gets to fly on his or her plane. Unfortunately, it's most of the time his plane. If the pilot needs, however, a really good reason for asking somebody to leave. So you want to know if it's the pilot who is asking this. And that also helps to redirect the discriminatory flight attendant or whoever that she can't harass you. Unfortunately, it's a lot of times she or he can harass you. And then you also want to point that ultimately the pilot has the authority to determine whether or not you can travel. If they ask you to come off the plane before it takes off, ask if you are, make the first thing say, if we clarify that, am I allowed to reboard the plane? Because why answer a bunch of questions if they're not going to let you back on anyways, right? So ask, am I allowed to reboard the plane? Take videos and pictures and get the names, the cards, and physical descriptions of everyone that you encounter in these situations. Okay, going through customs. Again, customs is basically a port of entry when you're trying to come back into the United States at an airport. Okay? It's also a land port of entry, so this applies to both. First of all, make sure you fill out the customs cards truthfully, because if you give a card and then you say something different, now you're providing an inconsistent statement. You have to answer truthfully. If you're not sure, like write it in the notes, like not sure or would like clarification on this question or something like that. If you are on a watch list, your name will be sent ahead through a system they call AVIS, and it will be sent ahead to the customs officials on the ground at the airport. So don't be surprised if when you're traveling and the plane lands, you are called as the first person to deboard and you're met by people there. It's nothing scary, it just means that you're on a watch list and they sent your name ahead of time. And they're trying to get you out before they do the traditional deplaning process. So there are two processes at customs. One is called primary questioning, and that's what everyone goes through. US citizen, non-citizen, everyone goes through primary questioning. However, there's a secondary questioning process for people that they want to do additional advanced screening with. Again, you may be taken directly from the plane and be taken to secondary. So they will do primary and secondary in a separate room. Or sometimes you get off the plane, traditional way, go through primary, and then they take you aside to secondary. Secondary is a separate room. How do I know? Because I've been through this process. When you're there, ask to speak to a supervisor and get business cards again. Contact your family contact immediately. Excuse me, Miss Kazi, is there a Miss Kazi? Please come to the front of the plane. Well, they said I could show myself. So I'm getting on my phone, and I'm texting my family who's waiting for me. Hey, they're calling me to the front of the plane. I think I'm going to be taken away for secondary. Like, can you start calling around? Why is that important? Because they're going to take your cell phone, right? So if you don't get in touch with somebody right away, you're going to go into secondary questioning limbo, and no one will know that you're there. The reason why, after the first executive order, we knew people were there were because their family members were outside, like in the Bradley terminal waiting for 1, for 2, for 3, for 4 hours. But that's the only way that we knew people were there. So we didn't know about the dozens or hundreds of other people who did not have someone waiting on the other side. Respond to questions, and this is for everyone. Respond to questions regarding your identity and citizenship. Yes, my name is Amina Kazi. Yes, I am a US citizen. Or no, I am not, whatever it might be. US citizens only. You have an unqualified right to re-enter the country. Unqualified. They usually don't hold people for more than 3 hours. So you can expect it might take about 3 hours. You might come in the country in handcuffs, but you are coming into the country, right? There is no way that they can deny a US citizen entry into the country. LPRs, permanent residents, green card holders. You may have to answer additional questions relative to whether or not you may have maintained residency in the United States. So if you're an LPR, you should understand what that means. Things about how long did you stay, did you purchase property abroad, did you find a job abroad, things like that. Because each time you're coming in, it's kind of like you're going through this process again to have to show that you have maintained your US residency. Okay, next slide. Visa holders, it's completely up to you, right? Because you have no rights at the border. We're talking about know your rights, you don't have rights at the border. Like you have international human rights, right? But essentially your recourse at the border is so slim. So I would suggest report incidents of religious and political questioning if you are questioned that way. And then you can try things, right? Like, I'd really like to speak to a supervisor. Give me their business card. I don't see how this is relevant. This is discriminatory, this and this and this and this. But you do not have an unqualified right to enter the country. They can deny you entry. And then I put a PS, like, why are you traveling? Like right now, really, why are you traveling if you're a visa holder? You really want to think about that. This is like just a practical tip thing. Why are you traveling? Like if you have ties, a life, business, education, whatever it is here that is pertinent to why you're holding a visa, really, really think about what is taking you across that border. Because once you exit the border, getting back in, your Fourth Amendment rights, right, are like nothing at the border. Hardly anything. So, again, these things are the same as entering through the border during pedestrian walkway or in the car, land border. Everything's the same. Do you have to give your passwords to your phone or to your laptop? No, because you have the right to remain silent. But they can search it and they can seize it. They can search and seize anything that you're trying to bring through the border. Can they order you down to strip? It depends. Because, again, your Fourth Amendment rights against unlawful searches and seizures are not the same at the border. Strip searches are not routine, and they have to be based on reasonable suspicion and be done privately. It's just really, really tough stuff, guys. Really, really tough stuff. The only thing I would add to this is my story of why I got pulled to secondary. Is because when I was going through primary, and I am a US citizen, she asked me to pull my hijab back so she could see my ears. This is what the agent was asking me. And I said, no, I'm not going to do that. Like, I'm not going to move my headscarf around. She's like, I need to be able to do it so I can identify you. I'm like, but you're looking at my passport and my license. Like, my ears are not showing. Like, what about my ears will help you? She's like, ma'am, that's our policy. I'm like, well, I'm not going to do it. And so they took me aside to secondary. Like, I didn't have super extra legal knowledge about whether or not they can require me to show my ears. All I knew was my ID did not show my ears, I knew my religious practices, and I knew what I was not going to do. So I said, I'd like to speak to a supervisor. I'm not going to do it. So they took me into another room, and then I had to go through a whole process of verifying my identity with them. And same thing, I had to keep arguing with them of what, because they were trying to get me to show my ears and that they needed to see it and that it's officer discretion. I'm like, how will showing my ears help you to identify me based on a picture, California driver's ID, which does not show my ears? And eventually I got through, but it did take an extra hour. These people are not like, some of them are just trying to do their jobs, but it's not like they're insanely trained and know what they're doing. So just protect your own self and your own humanity and your own dignity, right? You know your line, right? And just be really assertive and go through these things. I think that might be the last slide. Let's see. Oh, so what if this keeps happening? You kept facing this treatment. Like, the letter would say, my client is planning on traveling. Here's their itinerary. And they do not plan on answering any additional questions. You can also fill out a TRIP, a Traveler Redress Inquiry Program, which is a basic mechanism to try to say that you are not the person who is actually intended to be on a watch list, right? This system is not really set up for if you are the person intended to be on the watch list. It is like a super black hole, unfortunately, and there's been a lot of litigation that's been done around these issues. Lastly, I would like to say about the organizations you can contact. So I don't know if there's any clinics that do this kind of work on campus. I don't think so. There's CARE that I used to work for, Council on American Islamic Relations. There's the ACLU offices, the Asian Americans Advancing Justice offices that all do this. The NLG, we do not have an intake system for individual cases, but we do volunteer with all these offices to do this work. So basically, you get into the intake system of one of these organizations, and they can help with some of these. So thank you so much, and I guess we'll go over questions or comments now.
You know, some of this will turn on the employer and what the employer does, right? So in some rate situations, the ICE agent doesn't actually have a warrant. They're entering with the consent of the business owner, and they can do that with the consent of the business owner. So one set of conversations to be had in workplaces where, you know, where there's might be concerns is, you know, having, you know, making the owner also can require a warrant before their business entity is entered, right? So that can be protective in many cases, and so business owners should just be comfortable saying, you have a warrant, come on in, right? You're going to come in anyway, but if you don't, then you shouldn't be there and not consenting. So that's piece one. If they consent, then the officer does have the right to be present on the premises at that point in time, or if they have a warrant, obviously, but the agent has the right. Once the agent is lawfully on the premises, you still possess your individual rights to remain silent in that circumstance, right? And so some of the common tactics that we've heard about in this situation is the agents will request all citizens over here, and so it's really important for people to just be aware that in that workplace situation, yes, obviously agents can enter if they have a warrant. Yes, obviously they can execute those warrants if that means arresting particular individuals and they have a warrant. But there's no reason to sort of voluntarily succumb to investigative tactics. So that may mean not sorting, not moving. And then you don't also, there's case law on this, you don't have an obligation to answer questions in that circumstance. It is, to the extent they're asking you questions, this is another consensual encounter. And so that means you can say, I don't consent to this encounter, or I'm not talking, or, am I free to leave? And there is solid case law, right? So if you're in the workplace and you're free to leave, then leave. There's no reason to continue the conversation. So again, many of the same things that would apply on the street would apply in the workplace situation, right? If there's no warrant, there's no warrant. And what happens in a lot of these situations is there's consent to the business owner, so the ICE enters on their consent, and then people feel pressured because there's now an armed ICE agent, there are a number of them in the workplace, to answer questions, to reveal information about themselves, to disclose their kind of place of birth, etc. But all of that is not something that people have to do. People often feel like, but it does change things on the back end when people litigate their cases in court when they have a lawyer. So I think, will it change radically what happens? I don't know, but it is really important, I think, because it can change what happens on the back end, and it may change what happens on the front end, right? There, ICE may not want to push it if they don't have a warrant, if they don't have your consent. There's no reason. So I think it's just having those conversations about sort of not consenting to things in the workplace. I don't know if you have any.
Perfect. Yeah. So I have a two-part question. So what should we be looking for in warrants? What should we be looking when we receive a warrant? And also, if there's a language barrier, can the person request that warrant be in their language? That way they understand what's going on, or speak to an agent in their language.
So the warrant needs to be signed by a judicial officer. Usually it has a seal and the name of the judge or magistrate. It needs to state with particularity the places to be searched and the items to be seized. So it has to have like a specific location. It needs to, like if they're looking for specific types of things, usually it's itemized. It won't go into such detail as such and such weapon used in such and such place, usually not like that. The warrant is only expressive of their authority to search, right? It has nothing to do with your consent, whether you acknowledge it or understand it or anything. All it is proof that they have the authority to search. So no, it does not have to be in a language that you understand or that someone would understand. But they are supposed to deliver it and then, or give a copy. And that's more policy. And they are also supposed to give you a receipt of items. And the reason why it's important to understand and look at it is not necessarily for challenging their authority in the moment, but challenging their authority post-search. Because if you try to challenge it in the moment, yes, you can. And again, this is about also preserving your own dignity and your humanity. You can try it, but you don't want to go so far as to obstructing, because, or then you can be charged for that, or they could have now cause to arrest you. So for example, like if they're searching like your roommate's room that is locked off and closed and say, hey, you know, it's my house, or like my name on the search warrant, that's somebody else's, you can't go in there. Then, and they still do it, then you can challenge it later, but it's not like you can do anything to stop it in the moment, if that makes sense. Does that help answer?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Hi. If I'm an American citizen and I'm entering the country, United States, and I have a passport, there is a cases when they ask to look at your phone, your social media. Do I have to provide that information for them or not? I know it's a common question, but it's...
Do you want to take that one?
No, go ahead. I mean, I think this is a new
Yeah.
phenomenon, but
Yeah, it's also a difference between what they think they have the authority to do and what we think we have the requirement to do. So I would say, no, you do not have to consent to giving your passport. And you can say things like, I do not consent. You can say things like, I'd like to speak to your supervisor. Or you can say, I'm going to exercise my right to remain silent. If you are a U.S. citizen, you are getting in, right? If you are a green card holder or a visa holder, again, you're going to have to start weighing. You just need to start weighing.
Do I give them my phone?
They're going to take your phone.
And I'm not American too?
No.
Do I have to give them passport?
No. You don't have to give them the password, but they will, if they have the authority to search and seize, they will take it. And so, if I have the phone and let's say you're the agent and you're trying to take it from me and I'm like, no, my phone, now that can be obstruction. You see what I mean? Because I'm resisting. I don't have to give it to them, but I just can't, hands up type of thing.
But I don't have to give them my passport.
Because you have the right to remain silent. But again, when I was talking about if you're like a visa holder or a green card holder, the more vulnerable you are, you just want to practically weigh how important is it for you to come into the country at that point. If you're a U.S. citizen, you are getting in. If you are a visa holder and you've got a sick mom who's on her deathbed on the other side of the country, inside the U.S., and you really want to get in, is it worth it for you to deny your password? I mean, that's just your call. It's just everyone's opinion. And also remember that you might want to also think about, and this is for being at protests or being anywhere, you have the right to remain silent, but you don't have a right to your thumbprint. So you might want to think about disabling. Oh, I forgot to talk about information security. All right, it was coming up. Basic information security is disabling your thumb recognition, because you don't have a right to your thumbprint. They have technology, if they seize your phone, basically they have these algorithms in this machine where they can just run potential combinations, and they can unlock your phone, get the password within a couple days if it's a simple password. So you might want to think my password is now 25 digits. And I'll tell you how I came up with my password. It's really easy. And no one will ever be able to break it. One day I put a lot of random stuff on my table. And my password is that random stuff with a couple digits. No one will ever be able to think about what those random things are, but it gives me a visual to remember. Now I'm a very visual to remember what my password is, because my password's 25 to 27 digits now on my phone. You want to do that for all your devices. And they have the right to keep things. After they seize that, they have the right to keep things. It's a very broad standard. based on what is reasonable for them to conduct a diligent investigation. So it could be 3 months, could be 6 months, could be a year. Also, basic information security. Don't carry sensitive things, documents, pictures with you, period, and especially when crossing the borders. It's very, very, very important. Also, I think you also want to be aware of human intelligence and informants. Informants have always been used in our movements. And so you want to be aware of people, and people become informants. They use this acronym called MICE, which stands for money, ideology, compromise, or ego. That's how they get people to become informants. So you always want to be aware of who in your room or in your movement or in your organization could be passing on information. You don't want to create broad suspicion, because within the movement we're trying to increase the love and sisterhood and brotherhood within our movement. But as an organizer, as somebody who's maybe a leader in your organization, you want to be aware of who may be providing information. And it's not always people involved with the government, because the right wing is so organized and robust, especially in this area. They send in their own people. When I was working on the UCIrvine case, UCIrvine 11 case, there was this guy, and he was so clearly an informant. Because what they do, they often come in and they're the most eager people, ready to help. They name drop like crazy, like, oh, so-and-so told me to come and talk to you. They're always taking pictures and always recording. And they often don't have like a typical reason or story of how they got involved with the movement. The story jumps around. So those are some things that you want to be very wary of. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, here and then in the election.
Hi, I was wondering if everything you said about the workplace applies to public space, because we're a public institution.
Yeah, so I think if, this is technically a public space, right? So do officers need a warrant to sort of enter, say, an administrative building or a classroom space? And although it's public, often they have sort of respected the same requirements in terms of warrant stuff. So you probably wouldn't expect to see an agent come into a classroom and say, without a warrant. There's case law on this. It's sort of sketchy. We have students that are actually sort of working through the specific details of what that would mean and what a public institution looks like. But generally, you wouldn't expect agents to come to the administrative offices of UCI and say, this is a public space, and so the expectations of privacy apply in the workspace and would apply there. But the same precautions would apply in terms of once they're there validly, and you might be a little bit cautious about assuming that perhaps their ability to be there validly is more fluid in a public situation. But nevertheless, it is still true that every individual still retains their right to remain silent. So even then, right, once they're there, it may be that their presence can be challenged if they lack a warrant. That may be a little more difficult in a public situation. It's not out of the question. And regardless, once they're there, individuals still retain their rights in that circumstance. So it would still be true in that scenario that they would want to not be voluntarily revealing information or turning over information, having conversations unless there was a warrant and you were, even then, even if they have a warrant and even if they are or having custody, that's not a reason to talk either, right? So, and I should be clear about that, right? The fact that they have the capacity to arrest you or have an arrest warrant in your name is not a capacity to make you chit-chat either, right? There's a reason that people have a right to counsel, so if you will wind up in that situation for whatever reason and you are under arrest, it's important there to continue at that way united to stand on the right and remain silent to ensure that you feel comfortable and counseled in any conversation that you're having with law enforcement.
And I would add that a lot of this turns, back to your question as well, the workplace, and a lot of this turns on just direct action and civil disobedience too. So especially for documented allies, what are we willing to do to help stop the deportations? And even within the rapid response networks that we're developing to provide legal services, there's also a especially when it's homes. Home raids just are so swift. Workplaces and businesses often take a little bit longer. So that National Warriors Guild, we have a training called about risk minimization and potential criminal consequences. So that's a training we could do. We do not do tactics and strategy, civil disobedience tactics, like how to block a bus, how to take over a building, like those kinds of things. So if you want that type of training, we can, I can refer you to some of the groups that do some of that as well. And also a lot of it is delay tactics. Delaying it so that the rapid response groups can get out there, the clergy groups can get out to help stop a raid. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. Is it always within your right to record a situation? Because I've heard of incidents and seen videos of police telling people to put their phones away or even confiscating breaking them. So.
Yeah, it's always within your right as long as it does not interfere with police activity. So again, a very broad standard. You have, okay, so just to back up a little bit, recording laws, the traditional law in California is that you need somebody else's consent to record. So you can't do surreptitious recording, right? Like you can't have a mic or phone in your pocket or record a phone conversation without the other party. It requires the second party's consent. But if you are recording something that's occurring in public, like open to the public eye, you can record as long as it's not interfering with police activity. So if the police are saying, put that away, don't record, they're wrong. If they take phones and destroy them, they're wrong. If they say to back up, like, I had because I'm with the National Warriors Guild, we do legal observing quite a bit. So once I was, it was the post-Trump, remember Trump was out here? It was after that in Costa Mesa, and an officer was saying, step back, man, step back. And I was recording, and I was like, step? Okay, step. Step back, man, I told you to step back. Right, step. You have to do what you feel comfortable with. Some people would not even do that. Some people would just be like, oh, okay. But we need to put pressure on the police because they're wrong. You can record. You do not have to consent. All these things. The ACLU has a great app. It's called Mobile Justice App, through which you can record police activity and then upload it and send it to the ACLU. So I would really recommend downloading that Mobile Justice App.
The only thing I'd add to that was one at the border.
Oh,
They'll take away, right? And that will, seizures at the border, I think, are very common. And that would apply in the airport scenario too. It's going to be difficult to report those situations because the laws on kind of search and seizure at the border are sort of permissive. And the second thing I would say is, goes back to the obstruction of justice point that you raised earlier, which is at what point will the officer be able to articulate an argument that what you're doing is functionally as an obstruction? And I think there's broad latitude to act before that kicks in, but again, it's sort of, you have to be aware that there are arguments that they can make, right, about the limits that you need to be aware of. So it's not sort of a limitless right that can be exercised just in any way you see fit.
And I would add too, just also be aware of what your positioning looks like. So if it's in the middle of the night and it's dark and you're pulling something out of your pocket to record, just how does that look to the police officers? We don't want anyone getting shot and killed, right? So, just be aware of your positioning, and you can say, officer, I'm just taking out my phone, things like that. I'm just recording, and put your hands up and very clear so they can see what you're doing. There was a case of a young man, it was really sad. He was less than 21, and he was driving late at night, and cops started chasing him. He actually called 911. He was a young Muslim Pakistani man. He actually called 911 and said, the cops are chasing me. Can you tell them to stop? Can you tell them to stop? He gets off on the freeway. They surround him, and he gets out of the car, and he still has his cell phone in his hand. And he did something like, no, don't shoot. And it's dark, it's late at night, and they shot him dead. And now, as an attorney, you're looking at that case like a potential police misconduct case, and because there's so much discretion afforded to officers in these situations, what would a reasonable officer have done? Like one attorney told me, he's like, yeah, he took the traditional like 3-point shooting stance. And I think they're still litigating that case or trying to figure it out. But I mean, these situations are very real and can become really very real very quickly. Any other questions? I think we were playing about a time to do role play, but yeah.
What about recording in your own home? Is that what they have a warrant, they're allowed to enter, you're allowed to record?
Oh yeah, record away. Record away. There's some great videos on YouTube of people recording door encounters. Again, we're advising don't even open the door, but if you do, like record it. People going through borders recording, or a passenger recording. And there's some just really great, I would suggest everyone watch these videos because it gives you really good tips of how to engage these officers, how to talk about your rights. But yeah, you can move forward. Yeah.
Do they need a search warrant to search your car?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so the answer is often no. You know, if they have a search warrant for your car, they can search your car. The question is, what if they don't? The car is mobile, and so car searches fall under the sort of automobile exception to the warrant requirement, in part because they're mobile. And so what that means is that if the officer can articulate probable cause to search your car, which is the same standard that you use for a warrant, but for a warrant you would go to a judge and say, Judge, I have probable cause, and they would say, yeah, that looks like probable cause, and sign it, and then you would come with a warrant. Well, in the car context, the argument goes, officers don't have time to go to a judge and get that signed because the car couldn't move. And so if the officer can articulate probable cause to search your car, then without a warrant, the officer actually can search your car. Now, they have to have probable cause, which is not nothing. It's a pretty, you know, it's higher than reasonable. It's certainly more than a hunch. It's even more than suspicion. They actually need to have some probable indication that there is criminal activity, the evidence of which is in the car. And if they have that, then they can search the car. Again, if they come to you and say, I'm going to search the car, you should ask, am I free to leave? And you should make clear, I do not consent, right? Those things should be stated very clearly, because what often happens on the back end is the officer will say, can I search your trunk? In a way that seems like they're asserting their authority, and people will say, yes, thinking that they don't have a choice. And at that point, it shifts to consent, and no cause is needed, and now we have a consent search. So you don't have to consent to it, but they might search it anyway, even in the absence of a warrant, and they can, under the law, search it even in the absence of a warrant. On the back end, though, they're going to need to be able to explain why they have probable cause to search the car, and that's sort of
You know, it's interesting, this reminds me quickly of the way you responded to the question about the workplace, about how they separate people and how people just kind of volunteer. Like, we are trained, for those of us who like from kindergarten, to listen to the bell ring, to line up, to obey authority, right? So I had a case once of this man, young man again, wearing traditional like garb, and he was leaving an IHOP, and there were officers in the IHOP, and they had had a consensual encounter in the IHOP. So when he was leaving, he saw the officer do this. So he pulled over, and then the officer approached the car and started questioning him. So now he comes to me and is like, I got pulled over just because of what I was wearing, and so I called the officer and I explained to him this. And the officer was like, I didn't pull him over. I was waving goodbye. The guy pulled over on his own, so I went to see what was happening and started talking to him. And I was just like, oh my God, what did this kid do? Why did he like pull over? And it just shows us, like, I would just recommend that all of us really think about where we're at in terms of dealing with the enforcement state. Do we have the courage to be like, I'm not lining up, I'm sitting down, I'm not talking, like I'm not pulling over. If you have something, you're gonna pull me over, you're gonna flash those lights, and you're gonna do this, and I'm still gonna have my right to remain silent. If you have something, like bring that criminal case or whatever, and I still have the right to remain silent and to an attorney. You know what I mean? And I think it's just really do some soul searching about where you're at in terms of dealing with the enforcement state to help protect your rights. I think that's about it, unless there are any other burning questions.
I just wanted to say, sort of following up on that, there is a real distinction between home and almost everywhere else. Right?
Yeah.
The home is the most protected space. Almost